The North Atlantic in 1942 does not forgive. PBY, Catalinas, B-24s, Sunderlands, 14 hours over water, hunting something that was also hunting them. 1,000 Allied ships sank that year. The only thing that could stop it was an aircraft barely adequate for the task. What closed the gap that no ship could reach? And could you have flown 14 hours over empty ocean, knowing there was nothing below you but cold? Subscribe. The real story is just beginning. The Republic F-105 Thunder Chief was the primary strike aircraft of the early Vietnam Air War, and the men who flew it flew the most dangerous missions in the history of American tactical aviation. The statistics are not ambiguous. Of the 833 F-105s built, 397 were lost in combat over Vietnam, nearly half. In no other conflict in American aviation history had a single aircraft type suffered losses at that rate while continuing to fly the same missions. The F-105 was not designed for Vietnam. It was designed for nuclear strike missions against the Soviet Union, fast, low-level penetration of Soviet air defenses, delivery of a nuclear weapon, escape at supersonic speed. Against North Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles and MiG fighters, this design philosophy created specific vulnerabilities that the pilots who flew it learned through experience that no briefing had prepared them for. The Route Package 6 missions, strikes against targets in and around Hanoi, the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aerial warfare at that time, were flown almost exclusively by F-105 crews. These missions required the aircraft to fly through a defensive network of surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and MiG interceptors that had been specifically designed, with Soviet assistance, to destroy exactly the kind of aircraft the F-105 was. The crews who flew these missions flew them knowing the loss rate. They flew them because the missions existed, and they were the crews assigned to fly them. The psychological burden of the Route Package 6 missions was specific and documented. Crews who had completed a certain number of missions, the number changed as the war progressed and the political calculus shifted, were rotated out. The knowledge of how many missions remained created a specific kind of psychological pressure that accumulated with each sortie. Crews who were close to their rotation number flew their final missions, knowing that the statistical probability of survival increased with each one they completed, and that the randomness of combat did not respect statistical probability. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom was the most versatile American aircraft of the Vietnam War, and, in many ways, the most psychologically complex. It was designed as a fleet defense interceptor, a missile-armed aircraft intended to destroy Soviet bombers at beyond visual range, using radar-guided missiles that would make the gun obsolete. Vietnam proved that the gun was not obsolete. The rules of engagement that governed air combat over Vietnam frequently required visual identification of an enemy aircraft before firing. This requirement, driven by legitimate concerns about friendly fire in a complex air environment, negated the F-4's primary tactical advantage. Crews who had trained to fire radar-guided missiles at targets they could not see were instead required to close to visual range, where the MiG-17s and MiG-21s they faced had specific advantages in slow-speed turning combat that the F-4, optimized for high-speed interception, did not. The early F-4s carried no gun. Crews who had exhausted their missile load in an engagement, or whose missiles had failed, and missile reliability in Vietnam was a persistent and documented problem, had no close-range weapon. The solution, eventually, was the addition of an external gun pod, and later, the built-in gun of the F-4E variant. The path to that solution was paved with engagements that should have been kills and were not, because the weapon that would have produced the kill did not exist on the aircraft. F-4 crews flew with a weapons system officer in the rear seat, a second crew member whose relationship with the pilot was defined by mutual dependence in conditions that tested that dependence constantly. The WSO could not fly the aircraft. The pilot could not operate the radar and weapons systems with the same efficiency without the WSO. In combat, this interdependence created a specific psychology, the knowledge that your survival depended not only on your own skill and judgment, but on the skill and judgment of the man behind you, whom you could not see. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider in Vietnam was a World War II aircraft fighting a war it had not been designed for, and performing a mission that no jet could replicate. Its role? Close air support and, critically, the escort of search and rescue helicopters recovering downed air crews required an aircraft that could fly slowly enough to work effectively at low altitude, carry enough ordnance to suppress enemy fire, and absorb enough punishment to survive the anti-aircraft fire that rescue missions inevitably attracted. The Sky Raider could do all three. No jet of the era could. The Sandy missions, the escort of HH-3 and HH-53 rescue helicopters into hostile territory to recover downed air crews, were among the most dangerous missions in the Vietnam Air War. The Sky Raider pilots who flew them flew low, slow, and directly into the fire that the enemy directed at the helicopters they were protecting. They suppressed that fire with ordnance delivered from altitudes and at speeds that made them vulnerable to weapons that faster, higher aircraft would never have encountered. The psychological dimension of the Sandy mission was specific. The crew being rescued was known, not a statistic, a person, a pilot whose call sign had been heard on the radio, whose position had been fixed, whose survival depended on the Sky Raider pilot completing his mission. The impersonal mathematics of strategic bombing did not apply. The Sandy pilot knew exactly what failure meant. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress flew over Vietnam from altitudes so high that the crews could not see the ground below them, could not see the explosions their bombs produced, could not see anything that connected their mission to its consequences. They flew in formations that were planned weeks in advance, following flight paths that were fixed and predictable, at altitudes that placed them beyond the reach of most North Vietnamese air defenses, until the surface-to-air missile systems improved enough to reach them. Operation Linebacker 2. The 11 days of intensive B-52 strikes against Hanoi in December 1972 produced the highest B-52 loss rate of the war. 15 B-52s were shot down. The crews who flew those missions flew them knowing that the North Vietnamese had identified the predictable flight patterns of the B-52 formations and had positioned their missile batteries accordingly. The solution? Varying the flight paths, changing the altitudes, introducing unpredictability into a system that had been built around predictability, came at the cost of the missions that proved its necessity. B-52 crews who survived Linebacker 2 carried a specific memory, the aircraft flying beside them, which had been there at the beginning of the mission and was not there at the end, replaced by a fireball and a radio silence that said everything that needed to be said. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, the Huey, was not a combat aircraft in the conventional sense. It was a transport, a medevac platform, a command and control node, a gunship, and a symbol. The sound of its rotors, a distinctive thwop-thwop that no other helicopter produced, became the sound of the Vietnam War, in the way that no aircraft sound had defined any previous conflict. Huey crews flew in conditions that fixed-wing pilots did not encounter. They flew at treetop level, into landing zones that were hot, actively defended, inserting infantry who were about to fight and extracting infantry who had been fighting. The transition from flight to ground combat and back to flight happened in minutes, sometimes seconds. The crew that had been at altitude 5 minutes ago was now on the ground, in the middle of something, and then in the air again. The medevac crews, the dust-off pilots, flew without weapons to areas where weapons were being used to extract the wounded before they became the dead. The Geneva Convention protected them in theory. The reality of the Vietnam War did not always observe the Geneva Convention. The Vietnam Air War ended not with a decisive aerial victory, but with a negotiated settlement that left both sides claiming outcomes the other disputed. The aircraft that had flown over the jungle for a decade flew home, or were abandoned, or were transferred to the South Vietnamese Air Force that would itself cease to exist within 2 years of the American withdrawal. The pilots who had flown them came home to a country that did not know what to do with them. The welcome that other wars had produced did not materialize. The parades did not happen. The acknowledgement that the men who fly combat missions require, not gratitude necessarily, but recognition that what they did was real and mattered, was withheld in ways that produced consequences that the country spent decades trying to understand. The jungle took what went into it and did not give it back. The aircraft flew over it for 10 years. The men inside those aircraft came home carrying something the jungle had given them that no debrief had anticipated and no transition program had prepared them to put down. Some of them never put it down.